So hey, senorita, I was thinking that
So I've probably transported it to Williamstown and have a look at something very special down here. And it's just over here. This is HMAS Castlemaine. This is a World War II survivor and an Australian built warship. So let's go have a look. So basically, I turned up to have a look at this ship and I thought it'd be a fantastic video for Anzac Day. We'll have a look at it and we'll talk about the service of the ship and what went on and how their lives were on board. And it was closed. And that's my fault. I looked at the website. It's open between certain hours on weekends and public holidays. I, being a shift worker, didn't think enough about it. I went on a school holiday, not a public holiday. It was not open. So a long way to go down a windy beach to a closed warship. But that's okay, because what we'll do is we'll talk about the general terms, we'll talk about the Bathurst class, we'll talk about the service, and we'll go another time, we'll have a look at the inside of the ship. So we'll make a part 2 about it. So, what is this ship we're looking at? HMAS Castlemaine was one of 60 Bathurst class warships built in Australia for the Second World War. Leading into the Second World War, Australia had very little resources in its navy. We're looking at about 13 operational ships in 1939. Remember, we're coming out of the Great Depression and everything we'd had in the First World War was hugely obsolete. The Navy had wanted ships that could serve as mine clearers. They wanted other ships that could serve as escorts and could hunt submarines. And they wanted ships that could lay mines. And it wasn't practical to build and maintain 3 different types of ships that could do all these functions. And most of the existing designs didn't really suit the Australian needs, and particularly the distances involved between Australian cities and ports. So they came up with the idea of building one ship that was capable of performing all these 3 roles. And this is what we're looking at, a Bathurst class. 36 of these would be built by the government for the Royal Australian Navy. The Admiralty had a look, and these things had the quantity they needed most, which was availability, and better still, they could be built in Australian shipyards and not stretched British ones. They requested 24 of them. 20 of those 24 were also crewed by Australians. So they kept Australian labelling, HMAS, but they served with the British fleet under British commands all over the world. Another 4 were built for the Indian Navy. These are often described as Australian minesweepers. Sometimes they're described as corvettes, and the truth is they didn't really fit in the existing moulds. It was the anti-submarine and escort roles at which these ships really excelled, and what Castlemaine would spend a lot of its time doing at war. It's telling that the last 20 or so of these warships built didn't actually have mine clearing equipment. It seems the Navy felt they had enough mine clearers and they focused on additional depth charges and other equipment to supplement the escort and anti-submarine role these ships performed. So how does this ship fit in the bigger picture? So with naval guns, size is actually really critical. Obviously a bigger diameter hull shoots a bigger diameter shell, which does more damage. But not only that, it has more energy, it has more range, and it has more accuracy. So if you take a battleship like HMS Rodney, it had 16-inch cannons, which is that big. That means the hole at the end of the barrel, and all the way down, is that big. It fired shells that were 900 kilos, almost a ton in weight, and it could fire them 36 kilometers. If we look at the heaviest guns in the Australian arsenal, the Navy at the time, the 8-inch guns on the heavy cruisers we had, like Canberra, fired 116 kilo shell. So half the size, but exponentially smaller shell. It could fire 28 kilometers, still a decent range on it. We get down to Bathurst class, they have a 3-inch shell that one person could hold. No, it depends on the weight, it depends on the type of shell. And they had about a 10-kilometer maximum range. So not just this, but even in range, to get 10 kilometers with a 3-inch shell, you've got to fire at a higher trajectory and come back down on your target. If you've got an 8-inch gun, you can fire it much more like this. That straighter trajectory is flatter. The shell spends less time in the air. It's more direct and it's much more accurate. If you're trying to attack a larger ship with a smaller ship in terms of armament of guns, you're going to be within range of their weapons for a long time before they're in range of your weapons. So you're at a huge disadvantage. Caliber was everything. The giant battleships were essentially just a platform to service these enormous cannons. So this is HMAS Rodney. It's a full battleship. We talked about the shells and what they were capable of. These were heavily armored, incredibly powerful ships. They were incredibly expensive. They required crews of up to 1,000 to operate. And there weren't that many in the world for that reason. They were designed basically to go out with other big ships and have that one-on-one confrontation with another country's navy. Next down the food chain were battle cruisers. Battle cruisers still had enormous cannons equivalent of a battleship. They had less armor and tended to be just a little bit smaller. And I'm not actually sure why they went about making them that way. Now, Australia did have its own battle cruiser in the early 1900s. HMAS Australia, which was the flagship of the early Australian Navy when it was first formed. It had been scrapped in the 1920s and was quite obsolete at that point. The economics of the time, and especially the Great Depression in the 30s, led to a much reduced fleet, and having a capital ship like a battle cruiser with a huge crew just wasn't practical or economical. Cruisers were the next step down. These were still big ships that could take part in major battles, but they were more practical, had smaller crews and smaller armaments. Australia had 2 heavy cruisers. These had 8-inch main guns, HMAS Australia and HMAS Canberra. In addition to this, we also had a fleet of light cruisers, HMAS Sydney, Perth, Hobart, and Adelaide. These had 6-inch guns, but were otherwise pretty similar, still big, capable ships. The Australian cruisers were actually modern, capable, and effective. We also had 5 V-class destroyers. The design of these was considered quite antiquated at this point, going back to the end of the First World War. However, they proved themselves to be pretty effective through the course of the war. Destroyers were basically small battleships that were designed to move around in the large formations to protect big ships like battle cruisers and battleships from torpedo attacks from light, fast ships. However, they were a practical ship that could be sent to do operations on their own. Between their anti-aircraft, main armaments, and torpedoes, they generally had the ability to look after themselves. So all these ships we've mentioned are designed to work together as part of a battle fleet. The heavy ships, the battleships, the battle cruisers provided most of the firepower. The cruisers supplemented this and provided additional support, and the destroyers acted as light, maneuverable ships to protect from fast-moving boats and torpedo attack, and to provide anti-aircraft protection. The next ships we come to were our sloops. So we had 2 Grimsby-class ships, and we were producing 2 more in 1939. These were not designed to be part of a battle fleet. These were escort ships. They are much slower. They could only do about half the speed of the other ships we've already mentioned. And they were designed for long range and endurance. They were designed to provide air cover and anti-submarine protection for convoys. And then we come to the Bathurst class. As we've already said, a combination of roles, a minesweeper, an escort ship, and a sub-hunter. But they're also practical for troop transport and all sorts of other roles. As convoy escorts, they were perfect. While they weren't fast, they were much quicker than the convoys that typically moved at sort of 10 miles, 16 kilometers an hour, or even slower. Submarines of the era were much slower underwater. All the escorts really had to do was be around in a position where they could potentially spot a submarine, which would be very vulnerable on the surface, and force it in underwater. Once underwater, they generally couldn't keep up with even the slow speed of the convoys. The main armament, the 3-inch gun, was easy enough to put a hole through a submarine. Submarines are not armored, remember, they have to actually be able to float and sink on demand. They also carried depth charges, and these ships were equipped with sonar for helping to pick up submarines and track them. Here we see the crew of Castlemaine loading a depth charge onto a pneumatic launcher. Those barrel-shaped objects are basically great big bombs that would float into the water, sink down to a predetermined depth, then detonate. And the idea was you would fire it in the water where you think the submarine is, and if you're close enough, the explosion, which looks like that, will create a shockwave that will damage or destroy the submarine. Supply and demand for early naval guns in the war was actually quite tricky. Early Bathursts were fitted with a variety of different naval guns that were all eventually standardised on the Mark IV 4-inch quick-fire gun. These offered the advantage of having a variety of shells. They could fire an anti-aircraft shell that was semi-effective. They could fire armour-piercing and high explosive, which could support crews landing somewhere. They also had the ability to fire starburst shells. If you think of a giant flare on a parachute that can illuminate a large area of ocean at night, very, very useful when you're looking for submarines in the dark. Further down the ship on either side, as you can see in this picture, were two machine gun positions. Early Bathursts were fitted with a variety of guns, just depending on what was actually available at the time. Again, there was a war on and supply was really tricky, particularly if you're making these things in Australia. Eventually, they were standardised to a 20mm Oerlikon, sorry if I'm getting the pronunciation wrong, cannon, basically. This was a pretty effective anti-aircraft cannon. It could also be used to engage sea and land targets if they were in close enough. As we move to the back of the ship, you can see the final gun position, which is up high on the deck here. This was another Oerlikon 20mm originally. It was replaced with the current fitting, which is a Bofors anti-aircraft cannon. Much more effective weapon late in the war in 1944. And this became the standard issue for the Bathurst. I highly recommend you have a look at HMAS Castlemaine's website, hmascastlemaine.org.au. It talks about the firing position from the rear upper deck there on the ship. And it says it was the natural place to put an anti-aircraft gun, because what would happen is aircraft attacks were most likely to come in from behind. By approaching from the rear of the ship, aircraft could line themselves up with the direction of travel, meaning the ship was more likely to move into the path of fire and pilots could better judge its evasive actions. It also lowered the closing speed, giving more time for the aircraft to complete the attack. The ship had a radar system as well to help it spot aircraft, and that was it for the air defences for these ships. So how did ships like Castlemaine clear an area of mines? And this is something I had no idea about. I'm learning as you are, and if I get some of the naval terminology wrong, I do apologise, but I'll give it my best shot. I am an amateur historian. If you want to correct stuff, please jump in the comments. I'm interested in learning. So there were different types of mines they had to deal with, but the most common is what we all think of as a mine. So a big ball-like object that's anchored to the seabed by some kind of anchor, with a cable or chain connecting the two of them. It sits below the waterline, and it detonates when it comes into contact with the ship. The ship bumps it, it activates a mechanical trigger, big explosion, bad things happen. Now, what they would do is we'd have our minesweeper here. It had a cable that ran out to a special kind of float. Now, this float had wings on it that kept it out and running parallel when it was dragged through the water, or near parallel with the primary ship. There's a thing called an otter board that kept the cable in underwater between these two objects, and there was a float above the little kite thing here. So essentially this cable would be running under the water, and I'm not the greatest drawer here, between the ship and an underwater keel, and there'd be a little marker on the surface. And that cable had a special cutting edge. It was orientated a certain way. And the idea is it would come through, it would sever the cable that anchors the mine to the seabed. The mine would float up to the surface, and then they'd deal with it from a safe distance with one of the guns on the ship. That was minesweeping. Now, they could run these out the left or the right side if the ships were working on alone, but what they would more commonly do is have one ship that was a lead ship, badly drawn ship, running a cable out to the side. Then the next ship would sit in the protection of that cable, running it out, and etc, 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 depending on how many minesweepers you had in the area you needed to cover. This means the subsequent ships were working in an area of relative safety. Obviously, the lead ship isn't and is at maximum risk for the mines. They did have a little protection though, because these mines were usually set to a depth to target large ships. So they didn't want to use a mine to blow up, a fishing boat or something small. They wanted to target either a big warship or a large transport ship, and they sank much deeper in the water. Minesweepers were deliberately shallow ships that didn't go far into the water. They were small, shallow ships that allowed them to maneuver around in shallow water. It also gave them an element of protection from these sort of mines. That's one sort. So the other sort of mines were influence mines, and they actually sound like much more modern technology. They would sit on the seabed, and they would be activated by a ship's magnetic field, sometimes by noise from the ship as it passed through. So they couldn't be swept because they sat right at the bottom. There's no passing a cable underneath it. There was none of these sort of tricks. Instead, what the Bathurst class ships did was they had a cable or a set of cables they towed behind the ship of unequal length, and they generated a DC current in those cables that created an electromagnetic field that actually activated the mines behind the ship, hopefully. These were much more dangerous mines to deal with. There were also acoustic mines that were activated by sound. So to protect the minesweeper itself, it had a degaussing system that I have no idea how it worked, but it neutralized the magnetic signature. The magnetic signature of the ship meant it was much less likely to activate one of the mines itself if it passed over. Many of these mines had counter mechanisms in them. So they were designed to let several ships pass through or let minesweepers pass through with countermeasures, and then make everyone think the passage was safe before detonating on the ship that came through later on. So they had to pulse this signal. They learned to do that fairly on, so it would keep tripping the counters over until the mines detonated. There were also acoustic mines that were activated by the noise of a ship as it passed through. There was a device, basically an oscillator, in the base of these minesweepers that created a noise that could detonate these mines at quite a distance. You can only imagine it must have been passing that noise through the hull of the ship. It could have been incredibly loud when it was running. Minesweeping was difficult, very technical work, and I think the people who did it are probably underappreciated. HMAS Castlemaine was built at the Williamstown dockyard, just a few hundred metres from where she sits today. Whether that's by design or by fluke, I'm not really sure. She was launched on the 7th of August 1941. The christening ceremony was done by none other than the wife of the Prime Minister, Mrs. Menzies. The ceremonial wine bottle was smashed, but the Castlemaine didn't seem to want to go down the ramp and launch into the waters. It was a really cold morning in Williamstown, and apparently the slipway had been covered with lard to lubricate it, but it had gone hard. So Castlemaine didn't budge. They actually had to hook up a tugboat and tow it into the water. Once operational, Castlemaine sailed to Sydney Harbour, where she started shakedown exercises and escorting convoys up and down the eastern coast of Australia. In August, in the night, she had a collision with the Manly ferry and needed a week of repairs at Cockatoo Island in Sydney Harbour. Once repaired, she was reassigned to Townsville initially and then to Darwin, and she was often escorting convoys that were resupplying troops in New Guinea. The Kokoda campaign was underway at this point. In November 1942, Castlemaine was lead ship on a task force that was given the job of relieving some commandos and picking up some refugees from Timor. A few months earlier, a team called Sparrow Force had been sent into Timor, and they comprised of commandos from the 2nd Independent Company, some other troops, some Dutch troops, and a small contingent of artillery. They'd been sent to Timor and in around Dili to sort of set up defensively ahead of an anticipated Japanese advance. When the Japanese had invaded, they'd invaded both East and West Timor with overwhelming force. The commandos had been tasked with defending the airfield around Timor. And basically, when the Japanese had come, they put up resistance but saw it was overwhelming and they'd withdrawn into the jungle. And from there, they'd been fighting a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese, opportunistically striking them and generally making life difficult for the invaders. Now, the Australian Army didn't know this. They'd lost contact with them. They'd assumed them lost or captured. Until one day they've actually received a radio signal from this commando force, and it turns out one of their number was an amateur radio enthusiast, and he'd managed to put together a radio that was strong enough to signal to Darwin, built in an old kerosene tin out of scavenged parts, spare parts, and things they stole off the Japanese in night raids. The small commando unit was tying down a much larger Japanese force. And essentially, without that, these Japanese troops would be available to assist the Japanese campaign in Kokoda, which the Australian Army really didn't want. So the decision was made to reinforce, resupply this company of commandos. In September, HMAS Voyager, one of the destroyers, had been sent to do this job. It had run aground in Bento Bay and then been spotted by Japanese aircraft, badly damaged in an air attack the next day, and had to be abandoned. Another attempt was to be made to relieve them in November. This time, Castlemaine was the lead ship of the flotilla that consisted of Castlemaine, another Bathurst Class Armidale, and the auxiliary ship HMAS Carew. The plan was that Carew, which was a bit slower, would head off first and arrive at Bentano Bay a little bit earlier ahead of the other two ships. Carew would unload supplies, pick up passengers, and head out into the bay just as the other two Bathurst class ships would arrive. There were about 100 civilians that were waiting. They were to be moved onto Castlemaine. Then Carew would ferry troops back and forward from the ships and the island. The corvettes left Darwin about midday the 29th of November. Just as they were leaving, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flew over the harbour, which is very unfortunate because basically the Japanese would know they're up to something from the very start. At 9 o'clock the next morning, they were spotted again by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that were probably looking for them. Knowing that large-scale attack was very likely, they radioed Darwin for advice suggesting that the operation be cancelled and rescheduled. They still had some distance to travel to their destination. They were instructed to proceed with the operation but promised air support. After deliberately sailing in the wrong direction for a little while to confuse any observers, they were attacked by a group of 14 Japanese bombers. The air support did materialise, and the bombers were driven off by a group of Bristol Beaufighters that flew out of Darwin. They were attacked again at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but neither side was able to do any damage. The attacks and the changes in course significantly delayed both of the corvettes. When they arrived in the early hours of the morning, there was no sign of Carew, and they waited out in open sea. Carew was sighted at daybreak and basically had assumed the corvettes were not coming, and they'd chosen to sail for Darwin with the civilians that they'd already picked up. The civilians were transferred to Castlemaine. Armidale and Carew went back to Bentano Bay to complete the mission. At 1 o'clock, the Japanese Air Force found Armidale, initially attacked by a team of 5 dive bombers. 2 aircraft were damaged by the corvette's anti-aircraft weapons, and the other 3 missed in their attempts. At 2 o'clock, there was a larger attack. 5 Zero fighters came in and attacked the corvette. They distracted the anti-aircraft crews who were shooting at them, while a group of 9 torpedo bombers came in low and attacked from different angles. Armidale fought hard for about an hour. It evaded multiple torpedoes in the water. At one point, one was released late and flew mid-air over the ship before hitting the water on the other side. At about 3:10, with the attack having lasted over an hour, she was hit by 2 torpedoes on the port side in quick succession. First in around the mess deck, which probably killed many of the soldiers on board, and the second into the engine room. The ship was sinking quickly. The order was given to abandon ship, and the anti-aircraft guns stopped while crews tried to evacuate. According to the survivors, the Japanese then started strafing the survivors who were left in the water. Seeing this, Ordinary Seaman Eddie Sheehan, one of the crew, had been wounded in the initial attack, put himself back into one of the 20mm anti-aircraft positions, having to tie himself to the ship because of the lean, and started firing on the aircraft again. He forced a Zero into the water and appeared to have damaged at least 2 others before he was dragged underwater. The Japanese aircraft headed for home running low on fuel. Sheenan would be awarded the Victoria Cross for his bravery. The ship's little shore boats both survived the sinking, and the survivors clung to those and made a makeshift raft out of debris. The survivors in the boat were picked up by another Bathurst Class Kalgoorlie. Reconnaissance aircraft spotted the second boat and the raft, but were unable to land to assist them, directed other ships into the area to help. The crew in the second boat were recovered. The raft was spotted, but it was never seen again, and eventually the search was called off. I found this picture online and I almost didn't include it in the video. I find it quite harrowing. This is some of the crew and survivors from Armidale clinging to a raft. They were spotted by a Catalina, a long-range reconnaissance seaplane. The Catalina's actually saved many, many sailors and downed airmen during the war, but the sea was too rough for it to land on this day and they couldn't help them. These guys were never seen again after this photo. If you want to reflect on anything on Anzac Day, I think reflect on this photo. I'm not a pacifist. I think war is a necessary part of our society and the way geopolitics works. If we don't prepare for it and we don't participate, then we're likely to end up getting rolled by those that are. However, the people on that raft are probably mostly what I consider kids, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. We pay for war with a lot of things, but most significantly, we pay for it with the lives of our young. The Carew was also found and came under sustained attack, but the plucky little ship survived attack after attack. Over 260 separate bombs were dropped at Kourou, but she got away, hiding at one point in a rainstorm. At 8 o'clock that evening, the whole mission was called off as 2 Japanese cruisers were spotted heading to the area. Kourou safely made it back to Darwin. Sinking of the Armidale killed 40 of its crew, as well as 60 soldiers from the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army who were on board. Castlemaine would continue its escort services. On the 15th of December, it was escorting the merchant ships Period and James Cook to Thursday Island when they came under attack from Japanese aircraft. 4 of Period's crew were killed. The 3 ships were attacked 2 more times on the 15th and then again on the 16th of December. No further damage was sustained, and the aircraft were driven off each time solely by Castlemaine's anti-aircraft teams. Castlemaine would continue to escort ships through northern Australia and up into New Guinea and the waters to the north until June of 1943, when she returned to Sydney, having been away for almost a year, 327 days. Almost all of this time was actually seagoing service and almost continually operational. Castlemaine would then escort ships around the east coast of Australia for a while before being assigned to Naval Command in New Guinea, escorted supply runs out in that direction, came back to Australia, spent nearly a year surveying and minesweeping northern waters in and around Darwin. The Pacific War ended on the 16th of August. Castlemaine was then assigned as part of a minesweeping flotilla. That flotilla and a group of other ships was sent to Hong Kong to reoccupy the British colony, and Castlemaine participated in this. She was actively involved in the destruction of leftover sort of small Japanese suicide craft until the end of September 1945, and then participated in mine-clearing operations in around the Hong Kong area. Castlemaine returned to Melbourne in November of 1945. She was paid off a month later and retired from active service. She'd steamed 117,000 miles and spent 13,000 hours underway during her war service. Castlemaine would be retained as a training ship for some time, non-seagoing training ship, and eventually she would become the museum ship and the last sort of fully equipped out example of a Bathurst class ship in Australia. For all the thousands and thousands of kilometres sailed by the 60 Bathurst Class Corvettes all over the world, HMAS Armidale was the only one that was lost to enemy action. None was sunk by weather or bad storms or running aground. 2 were sunk following collisions with other ships. You remember, these ships were doing escort duties at night in unlit conditions a lot of the time, so it's actually not that surprising. Bathurst not only served through northern Australia, several of them served with the Mediterranean Fleet, the Royal Navy. Some of them assisted in North Atlantic convoy escorts. They were part of the American fleet in the Pacific. There were 3 Bathursts, Cessnock, Ipswich, and Bathurst, the first of the class, that were present at the Japanese surrender in Tokyo Harbour. The Bathursts were eventually moved to second-line service. Some were sold to foreign navies, some were scrapped. The last one I can see that I think remained operational is kind of surprising. It's actually HMAS Bendigo. So Bendigo was paid off from Australian Naval service in September 1946, and she was sold to the Ta Hing Company at Hong Kong as a seagoing vessel and renamed, I'm not going to pronounce that. Later, however, the ship was acquired by the Chinese People Liberation Army's Navy and was rearmed and put back into naval service under the name Liu Yang. And she appears to have remained with the Chinese Navy up until 1988 before being retired. So the Second World War was by far the largest and bloodiest conflict for the Royal Australian Navy. We mentioned earlier the 13 warships that were in service at the start of the war. Let's see how they did.